Good afternoon, Christ Church. Welcome to Food for the Journey. And this afternoon we're going to be talking about Luke chapter 21, which happens to be Luke chapter 21 verses 25 through 36, which is the gospel appointed for this coming Sunday, the first Sunday in Advent. And it's a really interesting place. So Advent, again, this season of expectation, of hope, of waiting. It's the beginning of the church year as we look for the coming of our Messiah at Christmas, but also we look for the coming of Jesus again. And the readings are very interesting, and I'm looking forward to unpacking them here with Deacon Becky as we move through this season each week, because we're going to start, as this one is, we're actually in the Gospel of Luke towards the end, and which might seem strange because, well, we know what comes at the end of the Gospel, Jesus' passion. But this is where we find ourselves. And this first Sunday in Advent, all the lessons are so apocalyptic. And when I say apocalyptic, I mean pointed to the end times, pointed to either the coming, the second coming, or just kind of this idea that things are just going to fall away. And for some, reading apocalyptic text can be quite scary. So we're in Luke chapter 21, verses 25 through 36. We have the parable of the fig tree. We have there will be signs, the sun and moon, and the stars. So we're all trying to figure out, and what's really happening in Luke right now is people are trying to figure out what's going to happen with Jesus, and what does that mean if Jesus were to die. And Jesus is telling them some pretty tough things, but also there's hope and expectation in that he says this generation will not pass away before things will be fulfilled. A lot of this text is pointing to Daniel chapter 7. And for those who aren't familiar with Daniel in the Old Testament, that is it's like Revelation from the New Testament. Daniel and Revelation are both very apocalyptic texts, pointing to the end times, pointing to the fulfillment of things. Is really what apocalyptic literature does, is that, yeah, you go through some pretty hard stuff, but if you read to the end, it's quite powerful, the image that comes. You almost have to go through this kind of fire, and then you come out brand new. As one of the priests I used to work with, in terms of the passion, you can't have resurrection without death. So a lot of times with apocalyptic literature, you can't give some stuff up. You can't not give things up to get something new. And that's the hard part when you read these apocalyptic literature, because maybe we want to give stuff up, but we kind of want to know when and what and how, and well, we're just not given that promise.
And I will say that coming from an evangelical background into the Episcopal Church, of course, I'm very familiar with these passages that are used to sort of tell people they better straighten up, better get your act right. And, that's where sometimes there were a lot of people that did commit themselves to Jesus in response to staying away from the bad things that were going to happen, which this does speak, even in Luke, of some very difficult times, and especially that things that we don't have control over. And I know that's one of the things we always, as human beings, are always afraid of. Well, what do we have? How are we going to get through something and we don't have any control over? And I love the fact that in our Episcopal expectation that we do have these kind of texts looking expectantly to something that's going to be completed with our expectation for the time that we see Jesus coming as a very vulnerable child, as a baby, and then who he is going to be, as it talks about here, the Son of Man, which is also some of the reference we had back to Jeremiah that we talked about earlier today. The question, I guess the little divergence that I made is the fact that instead of trying to find out how I have to get my life in order just to be, is one of the themes that we have in Advent, which is the expectation, the hope. So we are to find a place of hope and expectation even when things are not necessarily the best. I heard a wonderful sermon yesterday that was snowboards and on Sabbath and on centeredness. And I think that's one of the things that we can take with this scripture especially, to center ourselves, to find those places that we can have a Sabbath and we can experience God as he's talking to us, because in edible, that's what he's drawing him to, even with this, is to himself.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. Because it touches again on this real theme I think we often forget in Advent, which is imagination. Using our imagination to imagine how God's already moving in the world, to imagine how we can participate in that reality. Because ultimately, God's coming to us constantly, each and every day, God's coming to us. And we each and every day have a choice to center our lives there or not. By way of an example, the Thessalonians, you go read Paul's letter to the church in Thessalonica, or 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. The Thessalonians were so interested in the signs, as we hear here in Luke chapter 21, of when Jesus was coming, that they thought it was going to happen tomorrow, figuratively, and they literally weren't doing anything. They weren't doing anything that Paul invited them to do, because they had just stopped. They were so worried about the signs and the times that they had stopped imagining how they could participate in God's redemptive work in the world. And I think that's the trick with Advent. Advent is a good time for us to kind of take a step back and look at it and survey our lives and survey what we're involved in and what we're doing and how it reflects God's kingdom and how we are participating at work in the work that God's doing, at school in the work that God's doing at school, in our homes, in our families, in our friendships, in all our relationships. How are we inviting God in? And how, and if there's a mess, or we know there's places where God's not, it's easy just to say, invite God in. Maybe that's not where we're at. But imagine, with some expectation and some hope of what God's already doing in that relationship. Take a step back and look at it. And I think that's part of the work of Advent. And I think that's why these apocalyptic pieces of Scripture that we will read over the coming weeks are important, is because they remind us of what we really can control. And they also remind us what God's already doing, whether we participate in it or not. As in this parable of the fig tree, Jesus says, this is what's going to happen. Heaven and earth are going to pass away, but not my words. There is no control we have over that reality. That is going to happen. And I think that's why it's really good for us to hear these things, to remind us that, we have a job. God calls us into a certain relationship and into a certain kind of work. But it's not to sit around and wonder about the end times. It's not to sit around and hoard and hold on to things, but it's to participate in justice, to participate in God's righteousness, and to do those, model those things out into the world. And then when we get to Christmas, when we get through this season of Advent, we celebrate what's already happened and what's already happening and what will happen again at some time in the future.
Yes. Well, I just learned something theologically, because I did not realize that then when Paul was talking to the Thessalonians and they had shut down. And I can see how we might be tempted to shut down when we see this kind of stuff. However, I'm also reminded of when everything was created, it was created in chaos, out of chaos, and that's where we sit. But that's where we also can find a connection, even in chaos, because it's part of who we are and where we are.
You're right. And when you think about creation, this is going to be really a bold statement, but the way things were created, they weren't created in these groups, in these categories. They weren't created in boundaries. There was not boundaries. It was one place. And then we kind of messed it up. So I think as we head into the season of Advent, I think it's really important that we Christians, not just Christians at Christ Church, not Christians that are kind of on the verge, but we as a people of God, imagine that dream that God has for us, to be in a relationship with one another, to be willing to have those hard conversations in places where they need to happen, whether it be the public sphere, the private sphere, wherever they happen, over topics and issues that are not in line with the gospel. What does that look like? What does it look like to imagine God at work in these different things going on in our world? Not look at those things and say, well, here's a sign the end's coming. Because we've been doing that for
A long
hundreds of
time,
years,
yes,
trying to
yes.
guess the end
Thousands.
time. But to look at things and say, are we trying to shut God out of this? Which is really a myth, but are we trying to do that? Or are we participating with God in what God's trying to do? These are really important questions, and this is really what Luke is trying to, and this is, at this point in Jesus' ministry, this is what Jesus is trying to encourage the disciples to do, which ultimately will fuel Paul, which will ultimately commit Paul to telling the Thessalonians, get up.
Yes.
Get up and start serving the poor. Get up and start participating in justice and pointing out those places that aren't in line with the gospel. This is the stuff that moves us, and that's why I think I get so excited about Advent, because it's that kind of hard reset. You reset your iPhone and you start it over and it works great.
Right. Yes.
This is our chance to do a hard reset on our lives, not just go through it and sing the hymns and do this and do that, but really look at our lives and say, how am I preparing again to receive this powerful gift? Because if we can prepare for December 25th, we can prepare every day of our lives. To get up every day and say, how am I receiving Jesus and God today? How am I going to become a place, as the early church fathers say, where God happens for those that we encounter? How am I going to create that opportunity, not by professing scripture to them, but by inviting them into relationship with me and then letting them start to see my relationship with God? It's really that simple. And Advent is the time where we do that.
And that's what makes it exciting.
It is exciting. Well, we hope you are excited, and we hope you'll come join us this Sunday, first Sunday in Advent. If you have any questions about these readings, or questions about Advent, or questions about the church, or questions about baptism, Eucharist, communion, you name it, you let us know. Deacon Becky and I are available. You can call the church office. They will get you in touch with us. You can find our email addresses on the website, www.christchurchtemple.org. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.